Hello everybody, it's Peter with an I, S-T-E-W-A-R-T. In previous episodes, Joe was apparently sleepwalking and fell down the stairs, and Nancy, Frank, and Joe decided to get their first phone. Chapter 4. From upstairs there was a rumble of running feet. Joe drifted awake in a state of discombobulation at the bottom of the staircase again. He was the last to wake up, but he wasn't going to be the last one at the door. As Frank came barreling down the stairs, Joe grabbed his foot and sent him flying forward, doing a Pete Rose dive in his pajamas. Nancy ran past them both. She was the first to clutch the door handle. The juggernaut of boys came and slammed her against the door. They all stood breathing for a moment, catching their wits. "Who is it?" she asked, trying to seem calm. A voice from the other side replied, "Telephone installation." Nancy started to open the door, but Joe motioned for her to wait. "Can I see some identification?" he asked. Nancy and Frank looked up to make sure they still didn't have a peephole. Nope. They still didn't, which made Joe's request so puzzling. "I guess," replied the phone installer. Relieved, Joe gave the go-ahead to open the door. They found the worker digging through a ridiculously thick wallet. "Oh, don't worry about showing us your ID. It's just that if you would have said no, we would have suspected something was up." "Well, I've come to hook up your phone," he said as he handed Frank a pad and a pen. "Go ahead and sign at the X." Frank was confused. He only knew a few letters of sign language, and why should he try to sign at an inanimate piece of paper? Maybe to get out evil spirits? Joe took them away from him, and wrote his name in that type of handwriting lazy people use when they don't have enough energy to lift the ballpoint between letters. Frank wasn't lazy, and he would always try to write his name, making each letter straight and perfect, and lift his pen between each letter. He could never understand why people would get so mad when they ordered him to sign his name, and he'd make the hand signals for F-R-A-N-K. They thought he was being smart. It was quite the opposite. "Do you have your phone here?" asked the installer. Frank fetched the box and pulled out the foot-sized phone, letting the huge blocks of styrofoam holders drop onto the floor. The installer took it, plugged a cord into it, picked up the receiver, and listened for a tone. "There you go," he said, having successfully installed their phone. He handed it to Nancy, along with a phone book. She listened to the dial tone. "It works!" she said, delighted. The boys couldn't wait to try it. "Great," said the installer. "Your installation bill will come next month." As the technician left, it struck them as only slightly odd that the cord from their telephone was laying out over their lawn and extended around the fence post. The kids were too excited about their new toy to ask any questions, and were naturally reluctant to inquire for fear their toy might be taken away, to take extra time to bury the line, or just to punish them for asking questions. "Thanks, phone installer person, come again," called Joe. He tried to close the door, but he couldn't because the telephone line was in the way. He had to slam the door shut. He dusted off his hands, having fixed the problem. He decided he would drill a hole in the door later, and while he was at it, he could make a spy hole too, so he could see out and spies could see in. Joe joined Nancy and Frank, who had the telephone in the middle of the table. They stared at it intently, waiting for it to ring. Nancy pulled her chair up, situating herself to be the first one to answer the first call. Frank and Joe saw her game, so they edged closer because they were going to be the first ones to answer the phone. Nancy drew up her hand, posing to snap at it like a cobra when it rang. Frank and Joe held their hands closer to the receiver. Each of them looked at each other, squinting their eyes, not wanting to blink for fear they would miss the lightning-fast draw for the phone when it rang. After a moment, the blood started running out of their hands. Joe had to hold his arm up to keep it posed. Their eagerness soon deflated. Nancy perked up with an idea. "Hey, maybe we should call somebody," she exclaimed. The boys agreed, rocking back and forth in their chairs with excitement. Frank started to dial a number, but then stopped. "I don't know anyone's phone number. Do you?" Nancy and Joe shrugged. "I've got an idea," said Joe, taking the receiver and cracking the phone book. After locating a desired number, he called. All three of them put their heads together so they could all bask in the excitement of making their first call on their first phone. It was like the time they got their first microwave. Their first cooked piece of bread was exhilarating. Their microwave lasted until they cooked their first frying pan. After a few rings, somebody picked up.
"Weiner and Associates,"
said the voice on the other end. The kids giggled at the title, Weiner. It sounded naughty. Joe tried to think of a cunning foil that would blow the person at the other end away with a blast of wit. But nothing came to his mind amidst the flurry of excitement. All he could come up with was, "Winner, winner, winner!" Indeed, Joe's witticism could have humbled Voltaire, Payne, and Swift, all in one stroke. He quickly slammed on the phone before the secretary at the other end grabbed at him through the receiver. There was a calm before the storm as Nancy, Frank, and Joe looked at each other. They screamed with excitement and cheered. Joe yelled, "Oh, bring!" Their fun was put to a dead stop, as if a cold bucket of water had been thrown on them. None of them were racing to pick it up then. Nancy and Frank prompted Joe to pick it up. Joe wondered if maybe he could just pack up and move away. With his luck, the new house he moved into would probably have a phone there too, and the dreaded Weiner and Associates would call there and tell the residents what an awful boy he was, and the stigma would follow him around like the smell of plague. Joe answered the phone cautiously. "Hello?" he said timidly.
"I just traced a call a few moments ago with my caller ID. Did you just call here?"
Joe swallowed in a dry throat before answering, "No." He hung up the phone and folded his hands quietly. "Maybe we shouldn't do stuff like that," suggested Nancy. "No," agreed Joe. Thanks for watching today's presentation, and don't forget to look up my podcast. Doesn't cost anything. Search for Peter Stewart, and don't forget the I.